The air in the garage was always thick, a heavy cocktail of smells that you could almost taste on your tongue. There was the sharp, clean bite of gasoline, the earthy scent of old oil that had seeped deep into the concrete floor, and the metallic temps of hot brakes. It was a smell that signaled hard work, a smell the young woman had come to associate with possibility. Every morning, she'd push open the heavy metal door, and that wall of air would hit her, and she'd feel a little jolt of excitement. Her official title was intern, which mostly meant she was the keeper of the broom and the queen of the rag bin. Her days were spent sweeping up metal shavings that glittered like tiny, dangerous constellations, and wiping down grease-stained workbenches until the original wood grain peeked through. But while her hands were busy with these simple, repetitive tasks, her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was in the engine bays, under the cars on the lifts, inside the complex minds of the mechanics who ruled this greasy kingdom. They were a tribe, these older men. They moved with a kind of confident, weary grace that only comes from decades of turning a wrench. Their uniforms were permanently stained, a roadmap of past jobs in shades of black and brown. Their hands were their most prized tools, calloused and scarred, with nails that were never quite clean. They trusted these hands more than they trusted any computer or diagnostic manual. They could tell what was wrong with an engine just by listening to the way it turned over, or by feeling a specific vibration through the chassis. To them, a car was a living thing, and you had to speak its language, a language of sounds and feelings. They spoke to each other in a shorthand of grunts, jokes, and complaints about their wives or their aching backs. They were good at what they did, the best in town, but their world was a small, self-contained one. And in that world, the young woman with the broom was almost invisible. She didn't mind being invisible. In fact, she found it useful. It gave her the perfect cover to watch, to learn, to absorb everything. When one of the mechanics, a big-bellied man with a graying beard, would be wrestling with a stubborn bolt, she would stop sweeping and just watch. She'd see the way he'd angle the wrench, the little jiggle he'd give it right before applying final pressure. She'd listen to the curses he'd mutter under his breath, not out of anger, but as part of a ritual, a way of coaxing the metal into submission. They never really spoke to her directly unless they needed something. "Hey kid, grab me the 10mm socket," one would yell out without looking up. And she would scurry over, find the right tool in the vast, organized wall of drawers, and hand it to him. He'd take it with a grunt, and she'd go back to her sweeping. A silent student in a very loud, very dirty classroom, the main subject of everyone's frustration, and the young woman's quiet fascination. Was the car sitting in the corner of the shop, away from the daily hustle and bustle? It was a 1969 Ford Mustang Fastback, stunning machine painted a deep metallic blue that shimmered under the fluorescent shop lights. It had long, sleek lines and a look of raw power, even when it was sitting perfectly still. This wasn't just any car. It was the shop owner's baby, a project he had been pouring his heart and his money into for years. He dreamed of taking it to car shows, of feeling the rumble of its V8 engine on a long, open road. But for the past 3 months, the dream had been stalled. The Mustang was sick. The problem was a mystery. The engine would turn over, it would catch for a glorious second, then it would sputter, cough like a tired old man, and die. It refused to idle, refusing to come to life. The owner, a tough but fair man named Sal, had let his best mechanics loose on it. They had rebuilt the carburetor from scratch, a delicate and time-consuming job. They had checked and double-checked the timing, making sure every spark plug fired at the exact right moment. They had drained the fuel and replaced it, thinking maybe there was water in the gas tank. They did everything they knew how to do, everything their years of experience had taught them. And still, the beast slept. The car had become a symbol of their defeat, a beautiful but silent monument to a problem they couldn't solve with their hands and their ears alone. Every time they worked on it, the young woman would find an excuse to be nearby. She'd be organizing a shelf of oil filters or cleaning a set of spark plugs, all while her eyes and ears were locked on the Mustang. She listened to their theories. "It's gotta be the fuel pump," one would say. "Nah, pump's got pressure," another would counter. "I'm telling you, it's electrical." A ghost in the wiring? They would run tests. shake their heads, and walk away, their shoulders slumped in frustration. They were looking at the big picture, the usual suspects, the problems they had seen 100 times before. But the young woman, with her fresh perspective, was looking at the tiny details, because her education wasn't happening just in the garage. When her shift ended, she would go home, grab a quick dinner, and then open her laptop. For hours, she would dive into the world of classic car forums, YouTube tutorials made by passionate gearheads, and digital wiring schematics that looked like complex, colorful maps. While the older guys trusted their gut, she was learning to trust data. She learned about the tiny, often overlooked things that could cause massive problems. She watched a video about how a single frayed wire hidden deep inside a harness could cause an engine to run erratically. She read a forum post about how a bad ground connection, something that looked perfectly fine to the naked eye, could wreak havoc on a car's entire electrical system. She was building a mental library of solutions that the guys in the shop, for all their experience, had never even considered. One afternoon, she was sweeping near the Mustang while Sal and his lead mechanic were staring at it with a shared look of defeat. "I just don't get it," Sal, the mechanic said, running a greasy hand through his hair. "We've thrown everything we can at this thing. It's got to be something stupid, something we're just not seeing." Sal sighed, his gaze fixed on the engine. "It's like it's breathing, but it can't get a full breath," he said. A surprisingly poetic description from such a practical man. The young woman's ears perked up. Breathing, but not getting a full breath. Her mind immediately flashed to an article she had read the night before about intermittent voltage drops in classic Fords. It's often caused by corrosion in places no one ever thought to check. She looked at the engine, her eyes tracing the thick, black cables that connected the battery to the engine block and the smaller, thinner wires that snaked around the firewall. She saw a small, flat metal strap, barely visible under a layer of grime, connecting the engine to the car's body. A ground strap, a familiar little sting of being overlooked pricked at her. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, what the problem might be, or at least a very strong candidate for the problem. But she also knew that if she said something, if she pointed at that dirty little strap and suggested it was the culprit, she would be met with smirks and dismissive laughs. They would see it as the intern trying to play with the big boys, book-smart kid who didn't understand the real world of grease and gears. So she said nothing. She just kept sweeping, the bristles of the broom making soft, rhythmic sounds on the concrete floor. She kept her head down, but her mind was racing, connecting the dots, forming a plan. She was still just the girl with the broom, an underestimated observer in a world that didn't yet know she held the key to waking the sleeping beast. And for now, she was perfectly okay with that. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, lazy shadows across the garage floor. The light filtered through the grimy windows, turned the air a hazy golden color, making the floating dust motes look like tiny dancing stars. It was usually the time of day when the work slowed down, when the mechanics would start cleaning their tools and talking about what they were having for dinner. But today there was no slowdown. The tension in the air was as thick as the smell of burnt oil. All of it was centered on the silent blue Mustang. Sal, the owner, stood with his hands on his hips, his face a mask of pure frustration. He had been trying to start the car for the better part of an hour, and the result was always the same: a hopeful churn, sputtering cough, and then dead silence. His lead mechanic, a lanky man whose arms were covered in a faded sleeve of tattoos, leaned against the workbench, shaking his head slowly. The other mechanics had gathered around, forming a small, defeated semicircle. They were all out of ideas. Finally, Sal had had enough. He let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to drain all the energy from his body. He reached into the engine bay, his movements sharp with anger, and pulled a large, greasy wrench from where it had been resting on the fender. He didn't throw it down in a fit of rage, but with a kind of tired finality. The wrench hit the concrete floor with a loud, clattering crash that made everyone jump. The sound echoed in the quiet garage, a punctuation mark on their failure. "That's it," Sal said, his voice low and rough. "I'm done. This thing's got a ghost in it, and I don't know how to exorcise it." He ran a greasy hand over his face, leaving a dark smudge on his cheek. The lead mechanic pushed himself off the workbench. "It's the electrical Sal. I've been saying it for weeks. It's a rat's nest in there. The whole harness needs to be stripped out and redone from scratch. It's the only way to be sure." It was a big, expensive, and time-consuming job, and he said it with the air of a man who was happy to pass the buck. From her quiet corner by the parts shelf, the young woman heard every word. She had been pretending to inventory a new box of air filters, but her full attention was on the drama unfolding by the Mustang. Her heart started to beat a little faster. She had been thinking about this car, this problem, for weeks. She had spent hours online, cross-referencing the car's specific quirks with the symptoms it was showing. The lead mechanic's words, "It's the electrical," felt both right and wrong to her. It was electrical, but not in the way he meant. He was thinking of a major, obvious failure. She was thinking of something tiny, something sneaky. Her mind raced back to a forum post she had read just 2 nights ago, written by a restorer who had been wrestling with the exact same model of car for over a year. His problem was identical. The solution, he had finally discovered, was a small, seemingly insignificant part that no one ever checked. The young woman's eyes drifted from the frustrated faces of the men to the engine of the car. She looked past the shiny carburetor and the thick spark plug wires, her gaze settling on a small, dirty area near the back of the engine block, close to the firewall. She saw it then, the thing she had been reading about, a flat, braided metal strap, almost completely hidden under a thick cake of oil and grime. It was a ground strap. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them, before her brain could scream at her to keep quiet. Her voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the heavy silence of the garage. "Have you checked the ground strap from the firewall to the valve cover?" Every head in the semicircle turned in her direction. It was as if she had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The mechanics looked at her, then at each other, their expressions a mixture of surprise and confusion. For a moment, no one said anything. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The lead mechanic was the first to break the silence. A slow, cynical smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He pushed himself away from the bench and took a couple of steps towards her, his boots making soft scuffing sounds on the floor. He looked her up and down, taking in her cleanish uniform and her lack of personal tools. "The ground strap," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Honey, we've checked everything. We're not amateurs. You think you know something we don't?" A few of the other mechanics snickered, nudging each other with their elbows. The young woman felt her face get hot. A wave of shame and anger washed over her. She had known this would happen. She had felt their dismissive glances for months. But having it spoken out loud was a different thing entirely. She wanted to shrink back, to mumble an apology and disappear into the storeroom. But then she looked past the mocking face of the lead mechanic and saw the car. The beautiful, silent Mustang. She thought about the hours she had spent studying, the passion she had for this work. She wasn't just a kid with a broom. She knew things. She took a small, shaky breath and stood up a little straighter. "On these models," she said, her voice a little stronger this time, "corrosion can build up under the eyelet where it connects to the body. It can cause an intermittent ground. It looks fine, but when the engine vibrates at a certain frequency, the connection breaks. It would make it sputter and die exactly like it's doing." The lead mechanic let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a mean sound. "Well, aren't you just a little encyclopedia?" he said, turning to the other guys. "She read it in a book." They laughed again, a little louder this time. The young woman's heart sank. She had made a mistake. She should have just kept her mouth shut. But then Sal, who had been watching the whole exchange with a tired expression, spoke up. He looked from the lead mechanic back to the young woman. He wasn't laughing. He just looked defeated. He was tired of the problem, tired of the arguments, and tired of the car just sitting there. He walked over to the Mustang and patted its hood gently, like it was a sick animal. "You think it's so simple?" he asked, his voice flat. He wasn't looking at her, but at the engine. "You think it's just a little strap?" He finally turned his gaze on her, and his eyes were hard to read. There was no anger in them, just a deep weariness. "You think you're so smart?" The young woman felt a lump form in her throat. This was it. The moment of truth. She could back down, apologize, and go back to sweeping floors. Or she could stand her ground. She thought of the countless nights she had spent learning, the genuine love she had for the intricate puzzle of an engine. She knew she was right. Or at least she was right enough to deserve a chance. She looked Sal directly in the eye, her jaw set. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear and steady. "I do." A strange look crossed Sal's face. It was a mixture of skepticism and something else. A tiny spark of hope. Maybe. He looked at his lead mechanic, who was still smirking, and then back at her. He threw his hands up in the air in a gesture of surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're all so smart, you fix it." He pointed a thick finger at the young woman. "Go on then, genius. You fix it." The challenge hung in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't a genuine offer. It was a dismissal, a dare designed to shut her up and prove her wrong. The lead mechanic's smirk widened into a full-blown grin. The other guys watched, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. They were waiting for her to fail, to crumble under the weight of a challenge she had no right to accept. The young woman felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. Even though there were only a handful of people in the garage, the air felt thin and hard to breathe. Her palms were sweaty, and her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was so much bigger than a car now. It was about respect. It was about proving that her knowledge, even if it came from a laptop and not just from greasy hands, was valid. She looked at the faces of the mechanics, at their smug, confident expressions. She looked at Sal, who just looked tired of the whole mess. And then she looked at the Mustang, its beautiful blue paint seeming to call out to her. She thought about the purr of the engine, the sound it was supposed to make. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and gave a single, firm nod. "Okay," she said. The next morning, the garage felt different. The usual chaotic energy of a busy auto shop was replaced with a strange, tense quiet. It was the feeling of a classroom right before a big exam, everyone waiting to see who would pass and who would fail. The young woman felt it the moment she walked in. The usual good-natured grumbling and loud jokes were gone. Instead, there were just low whispers and sideways glances. She was no longer invisible. She was the main event. She didn't say a word to anyone. She just went to her locker, put her bag away, and walked over to the small, rolling toolbox she had been allowed to use. It was mostly filled with basic tools, things an intern would need for simple jobs. Today, however, she added her own items. A sleek, modern multimeter and a laptop protected by a slightly worn neoprene sleeve. As she wheeled the toolbox over to the silent blue Mustang, she could feel the eyes of every mechanic in the shop on her back. They were like a jury. She was about to present her case. She didn't pop the hood and start grabbing wrenches, which is what they were all expecting. Instead, she did something that made them exchange confused looks. She pulled up a low, rolling stool, sat down, and opened her laptop. The screen came to life, casting a soft blue glow on her face. For the next hour, she didn't touch a single tool. She just sat there, her eyes moving from the laptop screen to the engine and back again. She was so still, so focused. She looked like a scientist studying a rare specimen under a microscope. The lead mechanic, the one with the cynical smile, was the first to break the silence. He leaned against a nearby lift, his arms crossed over his chest. "Well, look at that," he said, just loud enough for his friends to hear. "She's going to email the car and ask it what's wrong." A few of the other guys chuckled nervously, glancing over at Sal's office to see if he could hear. Sal was standing in his doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. "Maybe she's ordering a new engine on Amazon," another one chimed in, and the laughter grew a little louder. They weren't being openly cruel, not yet. It was more like the teasing you'd see on a playground, a way of showing that she was an outsider, that she didn't belong. They saw her laptop as a crutch, a sign that she didn't have the real hands-on knowledge to solve a problem like this. To them, a mechanic's most important tools were his hands and his ears. Not a keyboard and a mouse. But the young woman didn't seem to hear them. She was in her own world, a world of circuits and currents. On her screen was a digital, color-coded wiring diagram of the 1969 Mustang's ignition system. It was a complex web of lines and symbols, a map that most of the older guys would have glanced at and dismissed as newfangled nonsense. But to her, it was a clear guide to the car's nervous system. She was tracing the path of the electricity from the battery, through the ignition switch, to the coil, and then out to the spark plugs. She was looking for a break in the chain. It's a single point of failure that everyone else had missed. After an hour of silent study, she finally closed her laptop and set it aside carefully. She picked up her multimeter, a tool that looked like a futuristic gadget compared to the heavy, greasy wrenches the other guys used. She began to probe the engine's electrical system, her movements delicate and precise. She would touch one of the multimeter's sharp metal tips to a connection, then the other, and watch the small digital screen. Sometimes it would beep, a satisfying, solid tone. Other times it would be silent, or show a number that didn't look right. With each test, she was eliminating possibilities. Narrowing down the search, the mechanics watched, their smirks slowly fading. This wasn't what they had expected. They had expected her to fumble, to get confused, to start taking things apart randomly. But she was working with a methodical, patient confidence that was unsettling. She wasn't guessing. She was testing. She was letting the multimeter, an impartial machine, tell her the truth. The lead mechanic's smile tightened. He didn't understand what she was doing, and that made him uncomfortable. She worked like this for another 2 hours. The sun climbed higher in the sky, shining directly through the garage windows and making the air hot and stuffy. The guys went back to their own work, but they kept one eye on her at all times. They would stop what they were doing whenever she moved to a new part of the engine, trying to figure out what she was looking for. She started with the ground strap she had mentioned the day before. She unbolted it, used a small wire brush to clean the connection points until they shined, and then bolted it back on tightly. She tested it with her multimeter and nodded, satisfied. But she didn't try to start the car. She wasn't done yet. Her search led her deeper into the engine bay, to a small cylindrical component mounted on the side of the distributor. It was the condenser, a part so simple and so reliable that it was almost never the source of a problem. It was just a little metal canister that helped the points do their job. The mechanics had checked it, of course. They had tested it with their old analog testers, and it had seemed to work fine. But the young woman had read about this specific failure mode. A hairline fracture, almost invisible to the naked eye, could cause the condenser to fail only under the specific heat and vibration of the engine trying to idle. She leaned in close, her face just inches from the engine. She took a clean rag and wiped away a thick layer of grime that had accumulated on the condenser over the years. And then she saw it. It wasn't a crack, not really. It was more like a faint, silvery line. A tiny imperfection in the metal casing that you would never notice unless you were looking for it. She gently ran her fingernail over it and felt the slightest catch. That was it. That was the ghost in the machine. A tiny, invisible flaw in a $7 part that had kept this beautiful car silent for months. A quiet sense of relief washed over her. She had been so sure, but there was always a part of her that feared she was wrong. That she had been led down a rabbit hole by her online research. But now, holding the proof in her hand, she knew. She knew she was right. She stood up, stretched her back, and walked over to the lead mechanic, who was pretending to be busy adjusting a carburetor on another car. "I need to run to the parts store," she said, her voice neutral. He looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For a condenser," she said. He stared at her for a moment, then let out a short, dismissive laugh. "A condenser? We already tested that." "It's fine." "It's not," she said simply, without a hint of arrogance. "There's a hairline fracture in the case. I need a new one." He just shook his head and turned back to his work, muttering something under his breath about kids and their crazy ideas. But Sal, who had been watching the whole time from his office, walked out. "Go on," he said to her, his voice gruff. "Take the truck. Just be quick about it." The drive to the parts store was a blur. The young woman's mind was racing, going over the steps one more time. Install the new condenser. Check the spark plug gap one last time, and then try to start it. The weight of the dare, the weight of all their skeptical eyes, was still heavy on her shoulders. But now it was mixed with a new feeling, the quiet, steady confidence of someone who knew they had the right answer. When she got back to the garage, the small part felt insignificant in her hand. It was so small, so cheap. It seemed impossible that this little thing could be the cause of so much frustration. She walked back to the Mustang, the mechanics watching her every move. She didn't look at them. She just knelt down, used a screwdriver to loosen the single screw that held the old condenser in place, and replaced it with the new one. It took less than a minute. She stood up, wiped her hands on a rag, and looked at the engine. It looked exactly the same as it had before. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. The silent struggle was over. She had found the flaw. Now it was time to see if she was right. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and walked towards the office where the men were gathered. She looked at Sal, her face calm and determined. "I'm ready to try it," she said. The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy. "I'm ready to try it." For a moment, no one moved. The mechanics, who had been pretending to work while stealing glances her way, now stopped completely. The lead mechanic, who had been polishing a chrome valve cover with an oily rag, slowly put it down. It was as if she had just fired a starting pistol. And now the race was on to see who was right and who was wrong. A few of them got up from their workbenches and began to walk towards the Mustang. Not with any real purpose, but with a kind of morbid curiosity. It was a slow, reluctant parade. They expected to see her fail, to watch the car sputter and die, just as it had for them a dozen times before. They were there to witness the confirmation of their own experience, to be able to say, "See? We told you so." It takes more than a laptop and a fancy idea to fix a real problem. Sal, the owner, stepped out of his office doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of neutrality. He was the judge, and he was there to see the verdict. The young woman didn't wait for her audience to gather. She walked with a steady, calm pace to the driver's side door of the Mustang. Her heart was beating fast, a frantic drum against her ribs, but her movements were slow and deliberate. She wasn't just going to start a car. She was performing a ritual. She pulled the long, heavy door open, the hinges groaning softly. The smell of old vinyl and stale air wafted out. She slid into the worn leather driver's seat, the material cool against her back. Her hands gripped the thin steering wheel, her fingers tracing the cracks in the leather. For a moment, she just sat there, looking at the gauges on the dashboard, at the simple layout of controls. She was connecting with the machine, getting a feel for it before she even turned the key. The mechanics stood around the front of the car. A silent, skeptical jury. The lead mechanic leaned against the fender, his arms crossed, his expression one of bored confidence. "Let's get this over with," he muttered to the guy next to him. "I've got a carburetor to rebuild that actually needs it." The other guys chuckled, a low, nervous sound. They were trying to act casual, but their eyes were fixed on the young woman in the driver's seat. She reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. Simple, unnecessary action that was part of her process. It was a way to center herself, to block out the world outside the car and focus only on what was in front of her. Then she took a deep breath, held it for a second, and let it out. She inserted the key into the ignition. The whole garage seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the distant hum of the air compressor. She turned the key. The sound of the starter motor filled the garage. A high-pitched whir that was painfully familiar to everyone there. It was the sound of hope, the sound of trying. Then came the first cough from the exhaust, a deep, throaty sound that was followed by a sputter. The engine roared to life for a single glorious second, and the mechanics' faces fell. They knew this sound. It was the sound of failure. And just as they expected, the engine sputtered again, coughed one last time, and then fell silent. The starter motor whirred a few more times before she let go of the key. A heavy sigh went through the small crowd of mechanics. The lead mechanic pushed himself off the fender, a smug, knowing look already spreading across his face. He opened his mouth to say something, to deliver the "I told you so" he had been waiting all morning to say. But the young woman didn't get out of the car. She didn't slam her hands on the steering wheel in frustration. She just sat there, perfectly still. She waited a full 10 seconds, a pause that felt like an eternity in the silent garage. Then she did something different. She reached down and pumped the gas pedal once, a single firm press to the floor. It was a move that came from her research, a trick for priming a carburetor on a car that had been sitting for too long. Then she turned the key again. The starter motor. Word. The engine coughed. But this time, it didn't die. It caught. And what happened next was something no one in that garage would ever forget. It started as a low rumble, a deep vibration that they felt in their chests more than they heard with their ears. Then it grew. It built into a thunderous, earth-shaking roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The loose sockets on the nearby tool cart rattled against each other. A dusty calendar on the wall swayed back and forth. The sound was raw and powerful. The sound of a sleeping giant finally waking up after a long, long sleep. It was the sound of pure, unfiltered V8 muscle. The garage was plunged into a state of shocked silence. The mechanics stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with disbelief. The lead mechanic's smug expression was gone, wiped away and replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. The sound of the engine was so loud, so overwhelming, that it canceled out every other thought, every other sound. It was just the car, alive and angry and beautiful. The young woman, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard, kept her foot on the gas for a few more seconds, letting the engine roar and clear its throat. Then she slowly let her foot off the pedal. The roar subsided, settling into a lumpy, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that was the perfect, healthy idle of a classic V8 engine. It was a sound that was music to a gearhead's ears, a sound that said, "I am here, and I am ready." She wasn't done. She wanted to show them it wasn't a fluke. She gently pressed her foot on the gas pedal, blipping the throttle just once. The engine responded instantly, its RPMs climbing with an eager, powerful scream before settling back into that perfect, lumpy idle. It was a conversation, a perfect back and forth between her foot and the engine. The car was responding to her, listening to her. It was no longer a sick, stubborn patient. It was a willing partner. She let the engine run for a full minute, the sound filling the garage, washing over the stunned mechanics. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, listening to the sound of their own defeat. They had spent months, with all their collective experience and all their expensive tools, failing to bring this car to life. And this young woman, this intern with a laptop and a crazy idea, had done it in a single morning. Finally, she reached down and turned the key, shutting the engine off. The sudden silence was even more deafening than the roar had been. The only sound was the quiet tick-tick of the metal engine as it began to cool down. She opened the driver's side door and stepped out, closing it gently behind her. She didn't look at the mechanics. She didn't have a triumphant smile on her face. She just looked calm, as if she had known all along that this was how it was going to be. The lead mechanic was the first to break the spell. He walked slowly, almost hesitantly, towards the front of the car. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: disbelief, confusion, and the first faint glimmer of respect. He didn't look at her. He looked at the engine, his eyes scanning every part, trying to understand what had changed. His gaze finally landed on the small new condenser she had installed. It was clean and shiny, a stark contrast to the grime around it. He stared at it for a long time. Then he let out a low, long whistle. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sal, the owner, walked up to the car. He didn't look at the engine first. He looked at the young woman. His face was no longer a mask of neutrality. There was no condescension in his eyes now, no weariness. There was only a deep, profound respect. He reached out and gently patted the hood of his beloved Mustang, as if to thank it. Then he looked at her again, his eyes softening. "Good work," he said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying more weight than any loud shout ever could. "Real good work." The words "real good work" seemed to absorb all the sound in the garage. For a long moment, the only noise was the quiet, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the hot metal engine cooling down. It was like a countdown, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The young woman stood by the driver's side door, her hands tucked into her pockets, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze. It wasn't a hostile gaze anymore. It was something else, something more complex. It was the look of people who had just witnessed the impossible, and were now trying to rearrange their understanding of the world to fit it in. The lead mechanic, who had been the voice of their skepticism, was still staring at the engine. He took a slow step closer, then another until he was standing right in front of the open hood. He didn't touch anything. He just looked. His eyes, which had been so full of mocking confidence just an hour ago, were now wide with a kind of bewildered awe. He looked from the new, shiny condenser to the old, greasy ground strap the young woman had cleaned. He was retracing her steps in his mind, trying to see what she had seen. Finally, he turned away from the car and looked at her. There was no smirk on his face now, no condescension. There was only a raw, unfiltered curiosity. "How?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost rough. "How did you know about that?" "The condenser. I've been a mechanic for 30 years and I've never seen one fail like that." The young woman felt a small surge of confidence, but she kept her voice calm and matter-of-fact. She wasn't trying to gloat. She was just explaining her process. "I read about it on a forum for classic Ford restorers," she said. "A guy in Ohio had the exact same problem with his 69. He said it took him a year to figure it out. He said the hairline fracture is so small, it doesn't show up on most tests. It only breaks the connection when the engine gets hot and the metal expands just enough to open the crack." The lead mechanic just nodded slowly, taking it all in. He looked back at the tiny part as if trying to see the invisible crack with his own eyes. "A forum," he repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. He had always dismissed the internet as a place for kids and amateurs, a place full of bad advice. But here was proof that it was also a place where knowledge, real, useful knowledge, was being shared. It was a tool, just like a wrench or a socket, and it was a tool he didn't know how to use. "I'll be damned," he said again, but this time it wasn't a whisper of shock. It was a statement of fact, a quiet admission that his world was bigger than he had thought. Sal, who had been watching the exchange with a thoughtful expression, finally moved. He walked over to the young woman and gave her a short, firm nod. Then he turned and walked back towards his office, without another word. A small pang of disappointment hit her. Was that it? A good work, and then back to business as usual? She was still just the intern after all. Maybe nothing had really changed. She started to wheel her small toolbox back towards its corner, ready to resume her invisible duties. But then Sal's voice boomed out from his office. "Hey, you two?" he yelled, pointing at a couple of the younger mechanics who were standing by the parts counter. "Get over here." They scrambled over to his office door. A minute later, they came out, struggling with a large, heavy object. It was a toolbox. But it wasn't just any toolbox. It was a big, red, professional-grade rolling chest, the kind the senior mechanics had. It was brand new, the paint gleaming under the shop lights. The chrome handles shining brightly, they wheeled it over to the spot right next to the Mustang, the spot that had been empty for months. They positioned it carefully, then looked at Sal for approval. He came out of his office, holding something small in his hand. He walked over to the new toolbox and knelt down. He took the small object, which was an engraved nameplate, and clicked it into place on the top drawer of the chest. It was a simple brass plate with one word on it, her name. He stood up, dusted off his hands, and looked at her. "That's your box now," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "The Mustang is your project. You finish it. You do the tune-up, you check the brakes, you do everything. When you're done, you and I are taking it for a long drive." He didn't wait for a reply. He just turned and walked back to his office, leaving her standing there, staring at the beautiful red toolbox with her name on it. It was the most profound gesture of respect she could have imagined. It wasn't just a gift. It was a promotion. It was an official declaration that she was no longer the intern who swept floors. She was a mechanic. A wave of emotion washed over her, so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes. She fought them back, taking a deep, steadying breath. She walked over to the new toolbox and ran her hand over its smooth, cool surface. It was real. The atmosphere in the shop began to change after that. It wasn't an instant transformation, but a slow, gradual thawing. The lead mechanic, the one who had mocked her, started asking her questions. Not sarcastic questions, but real ones. "Hey, on that old truck over there, the turn signals are acting weird. You got any ideas?" He would ask, and she would walk over with her multimeter, and they would look at the wiring diagram together on her laptop. He was learning from her, and he wasn't ashamed to admit it. One of the other guys, a big, quiet man who barely spoke to her before, started making an extra cup of coffee in the morning and leaving it on her new toolbox for when she arrived. It was a small, silent gesture of welcome. Another time, she was struggling to loosen a particularly stubborn bolt on a different car, and one of the older mechanics came over, wordlessly handed her a longer wrench for better leverage, and then stood by until she got it loose, giving her a small nod of approval before walking away. They were accepting her into their tribe, not with a big announcement, but with 100 small, human acts of kindness and respect. A week later, the Mustang was ready. She had spent every spare moment on it, tuning the carburetor until it was perfect, checking the ignition timing with a light, and bleeding the brakes until they were firm and responsive. The car was no longer just a fixed machine. It was her creation. Sal came out of his office, jingling the keys in his hand. He tossed them to her. She caught them with a smile. "Let's go for that drive," he said. They drove 4 hours out of the city and onto the winding country roads. The sun was warm, and the air that rushed through the open windows smelled of grass and wildflowers. The V8 engine sang a powerful, constant song, a sound that made her feel alive. Sal didn't talk much. He just sat in the passenger seat, a contented smile on his face, listening to the sound of his dream car, finally doing what it was built to do. When they got back to the garage, he parked the car in its special spot, turned off the engine, and looked at her. "You did good, kid," he said. You did real good. Life in the garage was different now. The sound of her voice was a normal part of the daily noise, mixed with the clank of tools and the hiss of air wrenches. She was no longer an observer. She was a participant. She would come in the morning, grab a cup of coffee, and look at the day's work schedule, just like everyone else. She had her own projects, her own customers. She would spend her days bent over fenders, her hands covered in grease, a look of intense focus on her face. The other guys would come to her for help with electrical problems, a world she had now mastered. They respected her knowledge, and she respected their experience. It was a partnership, sometimes late in the afternoon. When the sun was setting and casting long golden shadows across the floor, she would be the last one working. The shop would be quiet, and she would be alone with a car, a puzzle waiting to be solved. She would finish the job, wipe the grease from her hands, and slide into the driver's seat. She would turn the key, and the engine would roar to life on the first try. It was no longer a surprise. It was an expectation. It was the sound of her skill, her passion, and her hard work all coming together in one perfect, powerful moment. She was no longer the girl they dared. She was the mechanic who blew them all away.